Good morning. So we're holding Daf Zayin. We're going to start from Amar of Shmuel Bar Yehuda. Shochalahem Esther. It's at the top of towards the top of Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, and we're continuing the Chazara, the review of chapter 1 of Megillah. So another teaching from Reb Shmuel Bar Yehuda is about the establishment of Purim. It says as follows: Reb Shmuel Bar Yehuda said that Esther asked the Chachamim that she should be established for all generations. In other words, we should have an everlasting name for Esther by mandating a festival of Purim, and that during that festival they should read the Megillah Esther. So they said back to her a message saying, if we're going to do that, we're going to incite the wrath of the nations against us, because they're going to claim that we're celebrating the remembrance of their downfall. So she responded and said, listen, it's not as if we're remembering or stating things that are not familiar to them. They know this already because it's already recorded in their own history books, and so therefore that's nothing to be afraid of. Now, once we recorded a message, an exchange between Esther and the Chachamim, the Gemara goes on to cite another exchange that took place between Esther and the Chachamim. So now, this statement is made in the name of Rav Chanina, Rabbi Yochanan, and Rav Chaviva, which the Gemara tells us that anytime you see this group together, you should just replace Rabbi Yochanan and put instead Rabbi Yonasan. They're saying that it's a mistake to say that it was Rabbi Yochanan in the group. It must have been Rabbi Yonasan. But what was the exchange that they taught? They taught that the exchange between Esther and the rabbis was as follows. It says, right? She said, write me, meaning the story of Purim, for all generations. So they said, look, there's a problem. There is a reference in the Torah, right, which mentions this idea of remembering the story of how we fought against Amalek, to mention it or to write it 3 times. What are the 3 times, right? 3 and not 4. So we already have 3, right? Which are the 3? We have in Parshas Beshalach, that was the first one, right? Where Amalek came to fight the Jewish people, and Hashem told Moshe to tell Yeshua about remembering Amalek. The second time is the end of Parshas Kitzesei, to remember the story of Amalek. And the third time is the story in the book of Shmuel with Shaul HaMelech. So since there's a verse that indicates that it should only be written 3 times and not 4 times, they said, we're sorry, we can't add a second, an extra book, which is going to be talking about how we fought against Amalek. What's Esther got to do with Amalek? Well, Haman was from Amalek, so fighting against Haman was fighting against Amalek, until they found a pasuk written in Torah, and so they learned from this pasuk that perhaps we could make an extra inclusion for Esther. How's that? It says, Ksiv Zois Zikar Basefer, write this for a memorial in a book. So it said like this: Ksiv Zois, write this, refers to the passages about Amalek that are written both here in Beshalach and in Kiseitze, in Deuteronomy, and the Zikaron, that is what's alluded to in the book of Shmuel, which is in the prophets. And then when it has the extra word Basefer, that could refer to the Megillah. And the Gemara goes on to say that this is actually a subject of a dispute between the Tanaim as to how to understand this pasuk. This pasuk appears in Parshas Beshalach, where it says Ksev Zois, right? And the question is, what is the meaning? So there's a dispute between 2 Tanaim how to interpret the pasuk. So one says that Zikaron refers to, as we just mentioned, the passage that is written in so the one opinion is that when it says right, that's what's written in Beshalach. When it says Zikaron, that's what's referred to in Parshas Kitzesei. And Basefer refers to the books of the prophets. That's what Rabbi Yeshua says. Rabbi Yeshua's opinion is that. But Rabbi Loza, he turns and he says that no, the way we are to understand it is as we had just previously explained it, that Ksev Zeis refers to both passages in the Chamish Chumshe Torah, in the Pentateuch. And the second one is what the Zikaron is a reference to what's written in the book of the prophets, and Basefer is what's written in the Megillah. Going further on this theme, whether or not Esther is to be included in the 24 holy books of scripture. So he says as follows: Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel that Esther does not contaminate one's hands. Now, what does that mean? It means as follows. There was a time where a number of enactments were made by the rabbis, and one of them was that in order to prevent people from storing their scriptures, their books, the scrolls, together with truma, which the mice would come and eat, they said, you know what? If you touch a scroll, your hands are going to become sheni l'tuma. They're going to become a secondary level of tuma. And if that's the case, it will make the truma invalid, because if your scrolls touch the truma, that truma is going to become invalid and you cannot eat it. And so now that would only apply to scrolls that were actually Sifrei Kodesh. And what are those? Those are the 24 books of the Tanakh. Well, maybe 23, because what we're suggesting over here is Esther's not one of them. Okay? Esther's not one of them, because Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel that the scroll of Esther does not make it your hands tamei. So the Gemara challenges this statement that we just brought up, because how could you say that Shmuel says that the hands are not metamei, and we're assuming that's because it's not part of the Holy Scriptures? Are you saying that Shmuel does not believe that Esther was written with the Ruach HaKodesh? Didn't Shmuel himself say elsewhere that Esther was written, Esther was said with the Ruach HaKodesh, right? So the Gemara tries to answer and say it was said with the Ruach HaKodesh, but there's a different type of level of sanctity that takes place when a person says something and when a person writes something, which means to say as follows: you can be given a mission by Hashem to write something, to say something, to communicate something with divine inspiration. But when it comes to composing something that should be written down and should be then included into the canon of scripture, right? That's a different type of Ruach HaKodesh. And Shmuel's view was that Esther was given divine inspiration, but it was just to be able to say it over, not to write it down. Gemara says, how could that be true? How could what you're saying be true? Because there's a Mishnah that states the following. There's a whole discussion about which books are metamei and which books are not. And in that Mishnah, it says as follows: Remeya was of the opinion that Keheles does not make your hands tamei. And then he says it's a matter of a dispute whether the book of Shir HaShirim makes your hands tamei. That's his opinion. Rabbi Yesi says Shir HaShirim does make your hands tamei, whereas there's a dispute about the book of Ecclesiastes, about the book of Keheles. And Rabbi Shimon says that Keheles was one of those things which was from the leniencies of Beis Shammai and the stringencies of Beis Hillel, which means that Beis Shammai was the one who said that a scroll of Keheles does not render one hands tamei, whereas Hillel said they do render their hands as tamei. But, and this is the point that we're using to challenge the view of Shmuel, it says over here, but Rus, Shir HaShirim, and Esther, they all do contaminate one's hands. And so clearly, right, this stands in opposition to what Shmuel had just said. So the reason why we're still going to accept what Shmuel said is because he still has one person, at least, who agrees with him, and that is Rabbi Shua. That Rabbi Shua taught in the Brisa above that the book of Esther was not included in the books of scripture, and according to his view, so then Esther's hands were not, and Esther's book would not make one's hands Tomei. Okay. Now that we were brought this second brisa, you know how it goes. It goes from one thing to another thing. So you just mentioned Kehelas, and you mentioned that it's a matter of a dispute whether it is or not going to be Matame Yodayim. So Reb Shimon ben Menashe, it was on a brisa. Reb Shimon ben Menashe says that Kehelas does not make your hands Tame. And what's the reason why Kehelas does not make your hands Tame? Because it's not really something that was written with divine inspiration. It's just the wisdom of Shlomo. Shlomo was a wise man, and these were the wisdoms of Shlomo, and therefore they're not considered to be part of Scripture. And since they're not considered to be part of Scripture, they're not going to make your hands tummy. Now, the rabbi said to Reb Shimon ben Asya, if we're going to follow your logic, then why is Kehelas only as small as it is? Do you think that's all Shlomo HaMelech had to say? I'm sure Shlomo had more to say. In fact, it's written that Shlomo HaMelech had 3,000 parables, 3,000 proverbs and parables that he had. So why would you have such a small book like Keheles? But and furthermore, and this is really the strong question on what Reb Shimon ben Menashe says. Shlomo HaMelech says, don't add to it, right? If it was just wisdom of Shlomo, what's wrong with adding? It must be that, number one, the reason why there's only that few, in other words, there's only 12 chapters in the book of Kehelas. So there's only 12 chapters in Kehelas. The reason is because those are the ones that he was given divine inspiration to write down, and not other things. Right? And the reason also why he says not to add is because this is not just his wisdom, but this is by divine inspiration. The Gemara asks, one second, why do you need to have a further proof? And what's wrong with the first proof? So he says, because if you're going to say that, possibly there were many more things that Shlomo HaMelech says, but, it was up to him to decide whether to write them or not to write them. So that's why it came along and says that by the mere fact that he tells us that not to add anything means that he was instructed to use the divine inspiration to say these things and to write them down. Okay. Now that we have all of this, we're really left undecided about whether Esther is indeed part of the Tanakh. Was it indeed written with Ruach HaKodesh or not? So the Gemara brings a brisa which tries to bring a number of proofs to say that Esther must have been written with Ruach HaKodesh. From the story itself, we could see certain details in the story, which the only explanation is that it was written with Ruach HaKodesh. So he goes through the few opinions. Rabbi Elazar's opinion is that it must have been written with Ruach HaKodesh because it talks about what Haman was thinking, right? When in the story of the Megillah, when Achashverosh calls Haman and asks Haman what to do for somebody who he wishes to honor, the Gemara goes on to say that the Megillah goes on to say that Haman thought to himself that the king could not possibly want to honor anybody more than me. And so therefore, how do we know this? We know this from Ruach HaKodesh. Rabbi Akiva says, we know that it was written by Ruach HaKodesh because it says that Esther found favor in the eyes of everybody. Now, how can you possibly know that? How can you possibly know that somebody finds favor in everybody's eyes, right? Unless you have Ruach HaKodesh. Reb Meir says, no. We know it from the fact that it says that this thing, the plot of Bigsan and Seresh, became known to Mordechai, and this must have been Ruach HaKodesh. He must have had divine spirit to be able to know this. Rabbi Yossi ben Durmaskis says that the reason we know that it was written with the Ruach HaKodesh is because it says that they did not lay their hands on the booty. Now, how would we know what was going on in all the provinces of Achashverosh that none of the Jews were touching the booty? The fact that the Megillah tells us that none of the Jews touched and laid their hands on any of the booty must mean that there was divine inspiration to be able to know that detail of the story. Shmuel says that the reason we know that this was written the way he presents his proof is as follows, because you have to understand, we just quoted a brisa. A brisa has Tanoim saying their opinion. Shmuel wasn't a Tana. Shmuel was an Amira. Shmuel, as an Amira, he says as follows. He says, if I would have been there sitting with all these Tanoim, right, when they would have presented all their proofs, you know what I would have done? I would have given them a proof that is better than all of their proofs, right? What is the proof that Shmuel brings, that he offers, that is better than all of the others? He says his proof is that when it says in the Megillah, they confirmed and undertook upon themselves, right? What does it mean? Kimu v'kiblu. It says it means that they confirmed above in Shamayim that which the Jewish people took upon themselves down here on earth. In other words, when the Jewish people decided to observe the festival of Purim and to establish it for future generations, this was something that was accepted and ratified up on high. Now, how could you possibly know that? How could you write that in the Megillah, stating to know what's going on above in heaven? The answer must be that it was written with divine inspiration, and that's how they were able to record what took place in heaven when they made the decisions down here about the observances of the practices of Purim. So Rava says about all of this that every single one of the proofs that were brought in the Brisa by these Tanaim, every single one has a flaw that you could basically question and therefore undo it. Whereas the view that Shmuel brought, in other words, his proof, right, there's no flaw, you cannot question it. And Rava then goes on to demonstrate how each one has a flaw, right? Rebbe Lezer's, I could say his view. What was his view? That Haman said in his heart, "Who would the king want to honor more than me?" He said that you could say it was just logic. The Gemara is assuming something which is very safe to assume. Haman was the highest ranking minister at the time, and so when he goes on to give an elaborate description of the things that should be done to the one who the king wants to offer, so it makes logical sense to say that he was thinking about himself. So that's no proof that it was written with the Ruach HaKodesh. Rabbi Akiva, right? So he says that what did he say? He said that Esther found favor in the eyes of everybody. We could say the same thing. It was logic. Why? Because it teaches us, the pasuk teaches us that every person looked at Esther and she appeared to them as somebody from their nation, and that's how we know. That's how we know that she found favor in everybody's eyes, because people tend to have a bit of an affinity to somebody of their own nation, and because this was something that was witnessed by everybody, how she appeared to them as someone from their nation, that's how the Megillah knew that she was found favor in the eyes of everybody. What about Remeah? So Remeah, right? Remeah's understanding also has a question that you could ask, and that is, why do you need to have Ruach HaKodesh to find out what Bigsan and Seresh were plotting? Don't we already know that Bigsan and Seresh were from Tarshish, and they were making a plot in their native tongue, and they weren't aware that Mordechai was on the Sanhedrin, and since he was on the Sanhedrin, he knew 70 languages, and since he knew the 70, he knew the 70 languages. That's how he found out. And what about the last one of Rabbi Yossi ben Dormaskis, that he said, how would they possibly know that none of the Jews laid their hands upon the booty? So he said maybe the messengers were sent from all these provinces to Mordechai and Esther to be able to report back to the king that none of the booty was taken, so that he shouldn't get angry. In other words, every single one of these proofs, right, have a logical explanation that doesn't need to rely on Ruach HaKodesh. Now, Rava said Shmuel's has no question, right? So Ravina commented, right, that there's a statement that people say one sharp pepper is better than a basket full of melons. In other words, even though Shmuel was not a Tana, but nevertheless, he was very, very sharp. And that being the case, he came up with a proof that was sharper than all the others. Okay, we're going to bring two more proofs that Esther was written with Ruach HaKodesh. Rav Yosef says it's from the words in the pasuk, and these days of Purim shall not fail from among the Jews. Right now, how's that a proof? How is that a proof? He says because this is a prophetic promise, right? That the days of Purim will never cease from the Jewish people. Now, how can you make such a prediction unless you have divine inspiration, right? And Rav Nachman Yitzchok says that we learn from here. It says V'zichram la'yosem mizaram, that their remembrance shall not cease from their descendants, right? That only if the Megillah would have been written with divine inspiration could they have predicted that it will not be forgotten. Now, if you look at the Tosfos, right, Tosfos says the problem that Rabbi Nachman has with the teaching of Rabbi Yosef is because when you just quote the beginning of the verse, and these days of Purim shall not fail from among the Jews, it could have meant of that generation. Obviously, the people who were directly impacted by the story of Purim, they would not forget what Purim was about, and they would celebrate it in their generation. So you don't need to have divine inspiration to be able to predict that. However, to be able to say the end of the verse, that it would not ever be seized from their descendants, that's something for which you need Ruach HaKodesh. Okay, now moving on to the next part of the Mishnah, which we said that the gifts of the poor, right, are, we mentioned Matanas Levi, right? We said Ein bein Adar Rishon la'Adar Sheni, but there's no difference between Adar Rishon and Adar Sheni apart from the reading the Megillah and Matanas Levi. So the Gemara brings a brisa that's going to define the mitzvahs and the obligations of Purim of sending Matanas Levianim, right? And Mishloach Manos. So he brings a brisa that Rabbi Yosef taught. Rabbi Yosef taught the following brisa. It says in the Megillah, O Mishloach Manos Ish L'Re'ehu, sending portions to one another. So from the verse, we can understand that it's two portions to one man, okay? Because Manos is plural and Re'ehu is singular. But when it says, Matanas Levianim, gifts to the poor, both of those words are in the plural, so it has to be two gifts to two people. So now the Gemara relates an incident that Rabbi Yehuda, the Sia, sent to Rabbi Oishia the thigh of a calf born third to its mother, which we're told is the choicest, the juiciest, the best tasting calf, and a bottle of wine. So Rabbi Oishia sent back to him the following message. He says, our teacher, by giving us these gifts, you fulfilled the mitzvah of sending portions to one another and gifts to the poor. Why? It seems because, these words are not included by everybody. Some people say we should delete it because we're not talking about Matanas Levianim right now. We're talking about Mishloach Manos. But the chiddush that's being taught over here is, up until this point, right, we don't know whether or not drinks can be included into the Mishloach Manos, right? You might think that Mishloach Manos, packages of food, needs to be just food, right? And it has to be different types of food. But here, by sending them the calf and wine, right, he's told that he's fulfilled the mitzvah of Mishloach Manos, all right, even though it's wine and food. So another incident about the mitzvah of sending the portions, we're told that Rabbah sent with Abaya to marry Bamar. He sends what did he send him for Shlach Manos? He sends him, by the way, if you're looking for ideas of what to send to your friends for Purim, the Gemara tells you over here some ideas of what you could send. It says he sent a basket filled with dates, right? And a cup filled with flour of roasted wheat. That's what he sent to him. So Abaye said to Rabbah before he took it, he says, you know what Mari's going to say about you? He's going to say, if a peasant becomes the king, does he not take the basket that he used to feed his animals down off his neck? In other words, why, once you are so respected, right, and you've moved up in life, you've become such a great master and teacher, are you sending something which is not according to your stature? So Mari, right, Mari Bamar said back to Rabbah through Abaya, he sends to him his mishlach manas, a basket filled with ginger and a cup filled with long peppers. So Abaya says he said to Mari Barmar, you know what Rabbah's going to say about you? He's going to say, I sent him sweet foods and he sent me back bitter ones, right? Like his name, which is Mari. Yeah. Anyway, more about the same instance. So Abaya said that when I left Rabbah's house to go to Mari, I was full. But when I got there, they gave me 60 plates of 60 types of cooked food. And I ate 60 pieces, meaning one of each of them. And the last dish they gave me, which was a pot roast, right? That's what I ate. And after eating it, I wanted to eat the plate, right? I would say, so he says, so Abaye says about this incident that this is what people say. A poor person doesn't know when he's hungry. I thought I was full, but then when I saw all this food, I didn't realize how hungry I was. And this is, this is also what people say. There's always room for dessert. There's always room for dessert. Okay, so now Gemara tells us the following: Abaya bar Avin and Chanina bar Avin, they exchanged their Purim feast with one another. In other words, one provided the meal one year, and the other provided the meal the next year, right? So now, Rava says that a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until he gets to a point when he's reading the poem about who's blessed and who's cursed, right? So he will not know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And as Rava was the one, so Rava says this teaching. Once we mentioned this teaching of Rava, right, about you're supposed to get intoxicated and drink wine, right? We tell a story about how that actually happened. That Rabbah and Reb Zera, they celebrated Purim together, they ate the feast together, and they became intoxicated. So Rabbah got up and he slaughtered Reb Zera. The next day he asked for mercy, and he revived him. Now, understanding this story is, something that so many pages have been written to try and interpret it. Most people do not want to understand it literally, but rather they want to say that he gave him so much to drink that it was as if he slew him, because not that he actually died, but he felt so sick. It was as if he died. He was like literally, hanging in there by a thread. So the next day, Rabbah started to daven that he should have a recovery, and which he did. And then the following year, and when it came Purim again, so Rabbah asked Reb Zera, "No, come, let's have Purim together. Let's have the feast together." So Reb Zera said, "Thank you, but no thank you." Not every year do miracles happen. Not every year do miracles happen. Now, obviously, there's a lot to say. I said it last time when we learned this, different interpretations of this, but because this is just a review, we'll just move on with the Gemara. So Rava said, if somebody eats the su'uda of Purim by night, they have not fulfilled their obligation. In other words, yes, you have to read the Megillah by night, and we repeat reading the Megillah by day. But when it comes to the Su'uda of Purim, you cannot try and get it out of the way by eating it by night, and then no longer have the obligation to eat it by day. The obligation is to eat it by day. What's the reason? Because it says in the Megillah, days of feasting and gladness, days and not nights. In other words, when you're going to do the feasting, right, meaning having the special Su'uda on Purim, it's got to be by day, not by night. So now the Gemara relates an incident that took place where Rav Ashi was sitting in front of Rav Kahana on Purim, and it started to get late in the day, and the rabbis still have not arrived to study. So Rav Ashi asked Rav Kahana, right, why have the rabbis not yet come? So Rav Kahana said, maybe they're still busy having the Suda of Purim. So Rav Ashi said to Rav Kahana, what? I don't understand. Why could they not? Why didn't they eat the Suda last night? So Rav Kahana said back to Rav Ashi, did you not hear what Rava said? That if you eat the Suda by night, then you're not going to fulfill your obligation. So Rav Ashi was startled. He was surprised. He said, what? Did Rava really say that? He said, yes. Rav Kahana said, yes, he really did say that. So what Rav Ashi did was he went and he learned this ruling from Rav Kahana 40 times until it was secure in his memory. In other words, he wanted to make sure that he never forgets this. But I find it interesting, right, that Purim, it seems, from this story, is a day for learning Torah, right? Yes, there are many mitzvahs to do, but Rav Ashi and Rav Kahana was sitting there ready to learn, expecting to the other Chachamim to come and learn. Yes, there are things that you have to do, read the Megillah, deliver your Mishlach Manes, and have your Suda, but that doesn't mean that Purim should be a day where you don't learn Torah. There should never be any day that you don't learn Torah. Even Tisha B'Av, when one is not allowed to learn Torah, there are certain parts that you are allowed to learn Torah, you are allowed to learn from Torah, and one should always learn Torah every day. Okay, so now what happens is the Gemara started to list, or the Masechta really started to list, the differences between the first Adar and the second Adar. Once we have this formulation of Ein Bain, we have a series of Mishnahs in this tractate that talk about other things that are not directly related to the Megillah or to Purim, right? That also have this formulation of Ein Bain. There's no difference between one thing and another thing except for the things that are mentioned that they have in common. So that's what we're going to be doing in the next Mishnah, and the next couple of Mishnahs bring up these differences about different areas of Torah. So let's start. The Mishnah says that there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Tiv, that this is in terms of malachos that are forbidden. The different works that are not permitted on Shabbos are also not permitted on Yom Tov, and so therefore the laws would be the same, except for oichel nefesh bilvad, with regards to food preparation. When it comes to food preparation, there are certain things that are allowed on Yom Tov that are not allowed on Shabbos. So now, the Gemara basically learns out from the fact that it says that there's no difference besides preparations, food preparations alone, that they learn that with regards to preliminaries for food preparation, they're both equal, that the preliminaries are also forbidden on Yom Tov just as they are on Shabbos. So, okay, the Gemara wants to know whether or not this fits with a teaching of Rabbi Yehuda, and the Rabbi Yehuda taught in the Brisa that there's no difference between Yom Tov and Shabbos except for Eichel Nefesh, right? But then, right, that's what it says in the Brisa. And then Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says that Rabbi Yehuda permits even preliminaries of food preparation. So that clearly doesn't fit with our Mishnah, which we, although it doesn't explicitly say so, but we infer from the fact that it says only food preparation that it does not include the preliminaries for food preparation. So the Gemara brings a scriptural source for the opinions mentioned in the Brisa. The first opinion, which said that what? That there's no difference besides Eichel Nefesh, which fits with our Mishnah, by the way. The reason for it is because it says in the pasuk with regards to what is allowed and what isn't allowed. It says who levada ye'aseh lachem, right? So that alone, which is Eichel Nefesh in the pasuk, in the context, is talking about food, right? That alone are things that are permitted. But since it says who, it comes to exclude preliminaries. Yes, food preparation is permissible, but preliminaries to that to the food preparation, that is not forbidden. What's the view of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that even preliminaries are allowed? So he says, yes, it says who, but it also says the word lachem, for you. And what does lachem come to include? It comes to include lechol tzarchechem, all of your needs. All of your needs would also include the preliminaries. In other words, once it says food, right, and it says in relation to the food, lachem, so any type of need that you have to prepare food for yourself, right, that is possible. Frank the Gemara, well, why doesn't the Tanna Kama learn the same as Rabbi Yehuda from the word lachem? The Gemara says Tanna Kama uses the word lachem for something else. That who are you allowed to prepare food for on Yom Tov? It's only for you and not for non-Jews, for you and not for dogs, right? Which means to say that yes, there is an exemption of a malacha when it comes to preparing food, like you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, but you're only allowed to cook for Jews. You're not allowed to cook for non-Jews, and you're not allowed to cook for animals, right? Okay, but then if that's the case, what does Rabbi Yehuda do with the word who, right? How does he understand the who, right? So the Gemara answers that in the verse it says who, which implies the exclusion of preliminaries, but then it says lachem, right, for you, which implies the inclusion of preliminaries. And Rabbi Yehuda resolves this contradiction by saying that here, with the word that the that the verse refers to preliminaries, which could have been attended to before Yom Tov, but over here, in other words, there are some things that can be done before Yom Tov, and there are certain things that if you're going to do it before Yom Tov, you're going to impact the freshness and the tastiness of the food. So he says, when it says who, that refers to things that could be done before Yom Tov. If you could do them before Yom Tov, then you're not allowed to do them on Yom Tov. It's only these things which cannot be done before Yom Tov that are allowed to be done on Yom Tov. And that's how he explains the word who. What does lachem mean? Lachem means all the things that you need, even the preliminaries that are allowed to be done, so long as you need it to be able to to enjoy the food more than had you made these preparations prior to Yom Tov. Okay, the next Mishnah goes on to talk about the difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur. What's the difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur? There's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur. In terms of the malacha, there's no difference. In terms of the punishments for violating it, there's no difference, other than what? Other than the fact that if you do a malacha deliberately on Shabbos, then you get punished by the Beis Din, right? You're put to death, skila. Whereas if you desecrate Yom Kippur, then the punishment is going to be with kares, which is min ha-shamayim. That's the only difference. So just like we did previously, assume that when it says that there's no difference besides these, that it's coming to exclude other things. What are those other things? Those other things would be with regards to monetary payment. It means to say that both of them are equal with regards to this monetary payment. What's this issue of the monetary payment? There's a principle in the Gemara which says, Kamle b'derabba minei. When I have two things that I'm going to slap somebody with, right? They're going to have two punishments. We give them the harsher, and we then no longer give them the less severe punishment. So if somebody comes and he does a sin for which he's going to be put to death, like lighting a fire on Shabbos, but at the same time, you know what he did? He lit the field of his friend, which caused damage, and those damages need to be paid for. So we say, since he's being put to death, right? So therefore, he doesn't have to pay. Likewise, so what we're saying is that when we say there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur, we're saying that there's no, apart from that this one gets punished by by the Bezdin, and this gets punished by Kares, we're saying that comes to tell me that also comes to imply that with regards to Tashlumin, when we say Kamle B'derabim, both Shabbos and Yom Kippur are the same. Okay, so now who is the Tana of this Mishnah? So we want to say that the Tana of this Mishnah can accord with Reb Nechunya ben Akana. What did Reb Nechunya ben Akana say? It says in a Brisa that Reb Nechunya ben Akana considered Yom Kippur to be like the Shabbos in regards to monetary payments. Just as one who violates Shabbos and simultaneously does something for which he has to pay money, so he incurs the death penalty, but he does not have to make any payments. So too, Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana says Yom Kippur, if he violates Yom Kippur and simultaneously commits an act for which he has to pay money, so he gets the death penalty, which is, we said, kares, right? But he's potter from paying any money, right? So we're basically saying that Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana could easily be the Tana of our Mishnah. We learned elsewhere, right, that all those liable for kares, right, who were given malchus, become exempt from their kares. Why? How do we know this? What this means is like this. Let's say there was something for which you violated a negative commandment, and that negative commandment comes with kares as a penalty, right? But because it's a law, you can also be flogged for it, right? So we say if you were flogged for it, if you received malchus for it, then you no longer will incur the punishment of kares from heaven. How do we know this? Because it says in the pasuk, "V'nikla achicha leinecha," that that your brother will be the mean before your eyes, which teaches us that as a result of him being flogged and him being humiliated, he reverts back to being your brother, right? And these are the words of Reb Hanania ben Gamliel. So Rabbi Yochanan comments on this that the Reb Hanania ben Gamliel's colleagues disagree with him. So Rava says that they said in the school of Rav that Rabbi Yochanan's statement that others disagree with Hanani ben Gamliel, right, can be proven from a Mishnah, from our Mishnah, that there's no difference between the Shabbos and Yom Kippur, except for the fact that the deliberate desecration of this one is by human authority, whereas the deliberate desecration of the other, which is Yom Kippur, is punishable with kares. Now, if you're going to say that by receiving lashes from Bezdin down here, you exempt yourself from kares, then the Mishnah that we quoted, our Mishnah, right, which says that there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur, other than one is punishable by heaven and the other is punishable by earth, that wouldn't be correct. Why? That statement wouldn't be correct because if I can receive lashes to be able to get rid of the kares, then both Shabbos and Yom Kippur would be things that are punishable by the Bezdin down here. Gemara rejects this and he says, listen, who's the Tana of this Mishnah? It's Rabbi Yitzchok. What did Rabbi Yitzchok say? Rabbi Yitzchok says that there's no penalty of lashes for those who are liable for kares. And so therefore, as it was taught in the Brisa, Rabbi Yitzchok says that all forbidden unions that bear kares penalties were included in the Torah's general statement that whoever commits any of these abominations will incur kares, right? So then why, when it comes to the prohibition of being immoral with your sister, does it say that you're going to receive kares? Isn't it already included in the general principle which we mentioned earlier, right, in the Torah, that they're all chayav kares? So tell us to teach us that we're going to judge them with kares and not with lashes, which means to say that if you're chayav kares, the lashes is not going to, you do not receive lashes for that you do not receive lashes in the case of kares. Okay. So therefore, we have a problem we still have a problem. So 1 second. So that's how we. I'm sorry. So that's how we reconcile the teaching of Reb Hanani ben Gamliel. Okay. Rav Ashi says another way to reconcile our Mishnah with the opinion of Reb Hanani ben Gamliel is that you could even say that our Mishnah follows the rabbis who hold that lashes are incurred for kares, right? And you could still fit with Reb Hanani ben Gamliel's opinion that lashes absolve from kares. Why? Because we'll just interpret the Mishnah to be saying that when we say there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur, it's because this, in the case of Shabbos, the main punishment is by Beis Din, and when a person violates Yom Kippur, the main punishment is by kares. But it's true there would be a exception to the rule in the case where a person was flogged. Moving on, we're now starting Daf Ches Amud Aleph. Again, continuing on with this notion, this idea of there's no difference between one thing and another, except for. So he says there's no difference between someone who, between someone prohibited by a vow to benefit from another and someone prohibited by a vow to derive food-related benefit from him, except for setting foot on his property and using utensils for which people do not prepare food. So what is it? What? Okay. As Rashi points out, that the difference between Mudar Hanor, right, and Mudar Michael is that Mudar Hanor, somebody makes a vow not to have any benefit, is more severe than somebody just saying that I'm making a vow not to have any food benefit from you, right? But we're saying that although one is more severe than the other, really it seems that the only real difference is setting foot on this person's property and using utensils for which people do not prepare food, which means like this. If I say I don't want to derive any benefit from you at all, right? If you're going to give me even a ride, right, from my house to Aventura Mall, right? The fact is, had you not done that, right, I would have to spend my own money. And since I would have to spend my own money, right, therefore, I wouldn't be able to take that ride from you. But what happens if all I say is I don't want to have any food benefit from you? So you might think I could still get a ride with you from here to Aventura Mall. Why? Because I'm not getting any food benefit. The Mishnah is telling us you're still deriving benefit, because if you give me a ride and I could use the money that I would have had to pay to get a ride, or for the money that I would have to spend on gas to get there, I could have used that money for food, right? Since I could have used that money for food, so therefore I've had a food-related benefit from you. So the only difference really between saying I'm not going to have any hana at all from you, or I'm not going to have any food hana from you, is going to be where, in a case that I walk on your property, in a case where it doesn't matter for any money, right? You never charge anybody for that, or for you borrowing a utensil for which people do not use to prepare food, right? That's the only two cases. Says the Gemara, from the Mishnah we can imply that with regards to utensils with which people prepare food, both this one prohibited from all benefit and the one that's prohibited from benefiting any food-related benefit, they're identical in being forbidden to use such utensils. So now, with regards to the setting foot on the person's property, it says that people, with regards to this, do not care if others pass through their property. So why should such passage be construed as a benefit, that it should be forbidden to the one prohibited from benefit? So Rava says, who's the Tanna of Mishnah, Rebbe Elazar? That Rebbe Elazar says that even gratuities are forbidden to one who prohibited by a vow from benefit. In other words, we're saying like this: if you're telling me that the person who made a vow not to have any food benefit, right? He's allowed to pass through this field or this path. But we're saying the guy who made a vow not to have any benefit at all, why shouldn't he be able to have any benefit? Why should he not be able to walk through this? This is not something that anybody really cares about. So he says, because Rabbi Elazar says that somebody who said, I'm not having any benefit at all, even gratuities are not allowed. Even gratuities are not allowed. Okay. So now, the next Mishnah, following on in this theme of Ein Bein, there's no difference between vow offerings and gift offerings. What's a vow offering and what's a gift offering? So a vow offering is that when somebody says a neder, he's saying, Hare olai oila, I am going to bring up an oila, right? And then afterwards, he goes and separates it. So then he's obligated to bring up an offering, despite the fact that when he separates one, it goes and disappears. He has to go and get another one because he didn't designate this particular one. He designated himself, which is if to say, I'm designating a certain amount of money that I'm going to give, and that amount of money is always going to be an obligation on him until he does it, till he actually gives that donation, that vow that he made. But when it comes to an adava is where a person comes along and he says, this particular animal I'm going to give. I'm not accepting upon myself a monetary obligation. I'm saying that this particular animal I'm going to give. So at that point, if this animal goes missing or something happens to it, he's no longer obligated to bring another one in its stead. Okay, so there's no difference between a neder and a nadava, other than the case of in the case of vow offerings, one is responsible for the security, whereas nadavos, right? In the case of a gift offering, one is not responsible for the security. So that's the only difference between these two commitments. So the Mishnah the Gemara says that, so what's implied then is that with regards to the prohibition of leisa acher, to not delay the fulfillment of the vow, both the vow and the gift offering are identical, that they cannot be delayed. You have to fulfill your commitment straight away. So now the Gemara brings a Mishnah that defines and distinguishes between a vow offering and a gift offering. So we learned in a Mishnah, says, what is a vow offering? And so he says that vow offering is one who says, it's incumbent upon me to bring an oila offering, right? Hare olai oila. What's an adava? Somebody who says, ha'omer, hare zu oila. Somebody who says, this is an oila. And what's the difference between the darim and the davos? So he says as follows: the darim, if you made a vow, if they die or are stolen, then you're responsible for that security, and you have to replace them. Whereas in the case of gift offerings, if they die or are stolen, then the person who made that pledge is not responsible for the security, and therefore he doesn't have to replace them. So the question is, how do you know this? How do you know that in one case you do have a personal liability, in the other case you don't have a liability? Where do you get this from? It says it was taught by the rabbis in a brisa that it says, shall be accepted from him, for him, to atone for him, right? This is referring to an oila offering, that the owner of the sacrifice leans his hands on the animal, and it becomes acceptable to atone for him when it's sacrificed, right? So when it says v'nirtzaloi, so Reb Shimon says, es she'olav chayav b'achra yusai. That which is upon him, he is responsible for its security. In other words, when we're talking about a case of an oila, right, where a person made a neder, right? So there it says, olav. So we're saying when the pasuk says with regards to a offering the word olav, then he's obligated for its security. But olav, where it does not say the word olav, like for example in the case of an adava where you don't have this idea, so then he's not chayav b'achriyus, so he's not responsible for security. The Gemara, right? How's it implied from the words upon him, right, that he's accepting upon himself personal liability? So Yitzchok, but Avdimi says that since he said Olai, right, it's as if he said the burden of the responsibility rests upon his shoulders. In other words, we said before in the Gemara that you say Hare Olai. Hare Allah is as if you are personally accepting upon yourself the liability and the security of the offering that you're giving up. But if you didn't say Hare Allah, right, the word Allah over here, it's not really so much from a pasuk, right, but it's from the word Allah that a person says that it's the language of accepting responsibility. Whereas when a person says Hare Zu, right, there's no lie, there's no language over there that denotes me taking responsibility for the security of this, that I'm going to replace it with something if anything happens to it. And now, in order to be able to conclude today's shir with a cliffhanger, so the next Mishnah says, Ein bein zav haroya shtei re'is l'roya shalish. There's no difference between a zav who experiences 2 emissions and one who experiences 3 emissions, ela carbon, except the requirement to bring an offering. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? So, when a person has an unnatural flow, right? The unnatural flow is treated, right? Is treated like a balkari. And a balkari, someone who does not have to do anything other than clean himself and immerse himself into the mikvah. But if somebody has 2 zavs emission in one day, he's considered to be like the one who had 1 emission. But when a person has 3 emissions, right, then all of a sudden there is going to be a difference, right? Let's just look at Rashi for a minute, okay? The Rashi of this Mishnah, and we'll conclude with this Rashi. He says over here, if a person sees 2 sightings of this unnatural flow, right? If he sees them on one day, or he sees them in 2 consecutive days, and similarly 3 in one day, or if he has 3 sightings of this unnatural flow in 3 consecutive days, or 2 in one day and 1 the following day. But we're saying that there's no difference between the 2 or the 3 except for the carbon offering. That a zav who has 3 emissions, he has to bring a special offering of a pair of birds after counting 7 clean days, whereas the zav of only 2 emissions has no such requirement. But we're going to see that there are other issues that there is going to be a difference between that we're saying the only difference between seeing it twice and seeing it 3 times is a carbon. The Gemara will then go on to say, but there are other things that apply to somebody who sees it 3 times that will also apply to somebody who has 2 sightings of this unnatural flow. We'll stop over here to be able to fully understand this Mishnah. We're going to have to come back on Sunday to understand what we're talking about, and we'll go and review it in a little bit more detail. I wish you all a wonderful Shabbos, and thank you all for joining. Any questions?
Thank you, Rabbi. Take care, everyone.
Rabbi.
Good Shabbos. Bye-bye.
Shalom. Shalom.